that vertical standing drum, that style is something that you'll see, in West Africa proper. The cowbell, the agogo bell, is another one of those instruments that is connected with the people that are from Nigeria. The pandero is the tambourine is a Mediterranean instrument you'll find in North Africa, and so you can see all these different cultures that kind of like had the influence on the music or whatever else. And so, again, I say that to say that I do believe that the root and the foundation of capoeira is Central African, because it aligns with the way they train for warfare, and two, their cosmology, the way they viewed the world is reflected in the practices.
Mr. Da'Mon Stith is the Chief Instructor and founder of the Guild of the Sound Sword. He began his martial arts training at age 9 in Asian martial arts and progressed into African and Middle Eastern martial arts by the age of 17. He is also the founder and president of the Historical African Martial Arts Association known as HAMA, and he has his own weapon forge known as Street Forge Armory.
So, Mr. Stith, can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got started in the martial arts, what got you hooked, and then your journey up until this point?
Yeah. So, like any great story, it starts off as a young person, stormy day. My father presented me with this sword.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a steel sword. It was like a toy sword. Toy sword, but it was, silver handle and jeweled pommel and jeweled scabbard, and it was like I had never seen anything like that before in my life. I was 6 years old, and he gave me that. He also gave me a little toy gun, and back then that was okay for people to do. But I remember just being so fascinated by the sword, and I played with it until it just like completely fell apart, and I put it back together and played with it some more until it just disappeared. And what that really did for me, it just really awakened this curiosity into swords, into warrior culture, and then eventually into martial arts. I am a child of the 80s, and I was nourished and reared on 80s action and kung fu movies from the 70s and 80s. It was a pastime that me and my brother would often indulge in on Sunday mornings before wrestling. That was kind of the way it went. It was like kung fu theater in the morning, and then afterwards it was WWF wrestling and stuff. And that was like my early.
That was big back in the
yeah.
Sure.
So that's what got me really like into martial arts, and also because another thing that I do is I'm part of a fight choreography group called Cry Habit, and one of the activities that we would do as a kid is after we saw movies, we would go and just try to reenact what we saw.
Yes, sir.
And that was the beginning for me. I didn't start formally training until I was 9, and that was a very, very interesting experience. So quick story. I was not I won't say I wasn't a very athletic kid. It wasn't so much I wasn't athletic. As a kid you moved around, we ran, we climbed trees, we were active. But like as far as like playing like sports, team sports, like I wasn't into basketball, wasn't into football, baseball, any of that kind of stuff. But I was like, the football players, they got armor. And I'm like, wow, I was like, okay, maybe I should go try out the football team and I get to wear some armor and go on the battlefield and do the thing. So I went out, did the football thing. I'm like 9 years old, 8 or 9. I think I was 8 at the time, right? Tyndall Falcons. My stepfather was in the Air Force, and we were on Tyndall Air Force Base. And my stepdad was really, really into sports, so I was like really trying to impress him by doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So went in, signed up for the football team, did some of the practices, and suddenly the problem that occurred was like, well, the running, the drilling was fine. It was the running that was causing me problems because I had really, really bad asthma. Back then, asthma didn't really exist.
Sure.
It was just one of those things that, it didn't exist. And I'm being like facetious about this, but I'm just saying.
I have asthma too, so I understand.
Yeah. So every time we're doing the laps, it's killing me, and my coach doesn't have the wherewithal, the understanding, maybe even the training to be able to help me to breathe properly, to kind of help with that, to help mitigate the asthma. So, I started skipping out of practice. I started lying to my parents, especially to my stepdad, about what I was learning and what I had to work on. And just like any other story, it comes back to bite you at the end,
Yes, sir.
And I had to quit. I had to quit football. And I remember the day, because I had, it's like there's a way you carry your gear. You got your helmet through your shoulder pads and all the other stuff is in there. And it's like, you're walking, and I'm walking to the field, and they're already, doing their thing. And my coach was like the stereotypical coach from the 80s. I mean, he's like handlebar mustache, blue mesh back hat, tight shorts, long socks up to your knee, pocket shirt, polo shirt tucked in, and clipboard, everything. He was textbook. And I walked up to him, and I'm like, hey, he's like, Stith, get geared up. I'm like, sorry, coach. I'm like, I can't. I can't do it. And I explained to him why. Now, mind you, I'm 8 or 9, and I'm doing this by myself. My parents are not anywhere near. He tells me like, well, you're being weak. You're being a sissy. And he didn't say it as gently as I'm saying it right now.
Yes,
So, that was a moment that kind of really, to have an adult tell me, say this to me, it hurt. But in those times, this is like there wasn't a lot of, we weren't at the same place that we're at now, where we're understanding how people feel about things and have better ways of dealing with stuff. So that's what he said. He said what he said, and I left. I got on my bike. It was a banana seat bike, and I was riding past the youth center, and I said, "Hey, forget it. I'm going to the youth center," and I signed up for my first karate class that day. And so I started doing it was an Okinawan Karate style.
Shorter?
Well, eventually I went into Shorin-ryu when I got a chance to go to Okinawa. But for narrative purposes, it sounds better to say it was Shorin-ryu. But I have no idea I don't remember exactly what it was. But it was definitely an Okinawa style. And my sensei, his name was Sensei Don. He so I know that it was an Okinawa style. He was super, super pumped because the Karate Kid had just come out, and he saw it was in the movie theater, and he was like, "Yeah, it's like you gotta see this movie." It's like, yeah, they had this crane step. It was like very similar to our cat stance, and he was just really excited about that. But so I started doing an Okinawan style of karate in Florida. This is where Tyndall Air Force Base was, and I knew at 9, I knew what I wanted to do with myself. Like I knew what the path was for me. I didn't quite know how I was going to get there because I was not a very good student. My mom asked me, she was like, "Well, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And, I smiled at her. I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "I want to be a ninja assassin."
That's right.
That's what every little kid wants to be, right?
Yeah. So she checks in on me every once in a while to see kind of where I'm at on my career goals and stuff. But I didn't know at that time.
Hopefully we didn't get too far into the ninja assassin path, you know what I mean?
When we got stories to tell. I got stories to tell.
He's really here to assassinate.
Yeah,
That's
right. I'm on the job. Yeah. No, but I knew at that point in time that that martial arts was something I wanted to do and be a part of, and I wanted to share what I knew. And even when I was taking classes with Sensei Don, I was sharing what I was learning with my friends who couldn't come or weren't able to go. And I don't know, I'm just kind of like, I'm thinking about this because this is probably going to like kind of lay the foundation of kind of what my personality is like.
Sure.
You know, so I'm training with Sensei Don, and you know, I'm like, okay, you know, I'm getting this. I'm not really feeling the katas and stuff, right? You know, I want to punch and kick, and I want to do flips. I want to, like, you know, jump off the walls. I'm not really feeling this kata stuff, you know. So I focus very heavily on certain things, and other things I kind of was not really too into. Was with him for, the time is a little nebulous in my recollection, but was with him for a bit. Ended up breaking like a toe, doing something unrelated to martial arts, and I had to sit out for about a month. And then kind of like when I came back, I was on like a totally, like I've been watching one too many Bruce Lee movies, and by this time, like Sensei Don's, because we had started off with a really small class. And then like when I came back, because we were in like a little small room, the little small studio space in the youth center. But when I came back, we were in like the basketball, you know, gym, and you know, like there's all these like lines and stuff, and there was like the scene from Enter the Dragon. Everyone's doing the same thing, and I'm that one guy. If you go back and watch Enter the Dragon, there's this one guy. Everyone punches, precise, everything's precise. There's this one guy. He's like, It wasn't that bad, but I was definitely kind of like I was when we would do our thing, and he would like walk the lines, you know, like the Sifus in the Jackie Chan movies, and then every time the Sifu's like not, you know, can't see you, Jackie Chan takes a moment to kind of goof off a little bit or take a break. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So like I was doing stuff like that where every time he walked by, and I would break into my own little kata I had created. Not saying that you guys should do this at all, but just saying.
Yes.
Just to give you an idea of myself. But I eventually stopped training there, and just kind of was just on my own. And it wasn't until maybe a few years later when my family moved to Okinawa, that I like resumed my formal training in Okinawan Karate. Yeah.
That must have been exciting.
It was. I had reached a point of maturity where I was like, okay, like, yeah, I do want to punch and kick, and I still need to jump off walls, and I still got to do all this stuff. But I think I'm gonna try to focus more now, like on the katas and on the forms, and you know, try to be a more serious student in that sense. And going back to that, and just mind you, I'm a 9-year-old kid, and my stepfather wasn't too into me doing martial arts at the time because he felt like I wasn't, you know, like, I guess not that I wasn't disciplined enough, but like the amount of discipline that it would take in order to like stay the course was probably beyond what I was able to give at the time. And he wasn't terribly wrong about that, you know. But I stopped doing that class, and he asked me, you know, well, what happened? Like, what's going on there? And I'm like, well, you know, I was like, the teacher's holding me back. I know, it's bold, very, very bold, very, very bold and brazen. But just to give you an idea about, at least as bold and as brazen as it is, I had some kind of understanding of like what I felt I needed from the martial arts, and it wasn't a fault on the instructor he was given the art the way he had received it and the way he thought best to pass it on. I myself, looking back as an older person, just realized that as a kid, I wasn't trying to insult him. I was really just saying that there's something that I really, really need from this. The training is part of that, but there's something more that I need. And all this stuff kind of culminates into kind of where I'm at now. But
Yes, sir.
so I started doing Okinawan Karate, Shorin-ryu Karate with Grandmaster Fusei Kisei and his son Isao. And what really pushed me there, because I was still kind of training on my own and still, very much martial arts was a part of my lifestyle. But I had some issues with, I don't want to say they were bullies, but there were definitely people that I had certain conflict with. And, I was really at that point, it really was like, look, boy, you need to get serious, about, your training, just so that, you can walk in your skin with more confidence. So, I went to Camp Foster. Camp Foster was one of the Marine bases on the island. My school, because I'm an Air Force kid, but I went to a Marine school for military dependents. So I went to camp. I guess Camp Foster, Camp Butler is the same thing, large Marine base. But I went there and I went to the I think the NCO club, and they had classes there. So I signed up and started training with the Grandmaster's son, and then I was just kind of thinking about it. He spoke very, very little English, and he communicated a lot through
body language.
Yeah.
I had that same experience growing up. My grandmaster spoke no English whatsoever, so
Yeah.
I feel you.
Yeah.
But it makes you stronger, and it makes you really look at what he's doing, because you got to figure out on your own.
Yes, and I think that's kind of how because I learn by observing, and I'm a tinkerer. I'll take something, and then I may not get it right at that moment, but what I will do is I'll take it home, and I'll break it apart, and I will play with it, and I'll come to an understanding of it through, and always, I have this thing about, I guess it's performance anxiety, in the sense where it's I'll take it, I'll be quiet, I'm quiet in class, I'll get the information and I'll dissect it and work on it, at home, and then come back with it. But I don't do well sometimes, taking verbal instruction in that way. I can, so it worked well for me, just kind of to follow what he was showing and what he was doing, and looking at him. And that's kind of, I hadn't thought about that until we were actually, retelling the story. That's kind of affected how I learn, and then also how I teach. So
how long did you train under this guy?
Oh gosh, it was about a solid year. It was about a solid year, I believe, that I trained with him. And I got my my brown belt with him. And again, put a lot of focus on the forms this time, as well as other stuff. But I wanted to slow myself down and really try to figure this stuff out. So I jumped a little bit when I was a year before. I arrived there when I was 13, and this all happened when I was 14ish, when I started training with them in 8th grade. So our school, my high school. So I didn't go to middle school. High school was 7th through 12th.
Okay.
And that was painful. It was very painful. was hard being a seventh grader in that kind of environment, where it's like, you know, everyone's older, and you're basically like a baby, you know. So, before I had actually joined that group, that organization, one of the things that kind of had this profound effect on me as a martial artist was reading Miyamoto Musashi's book. And I chanced upon it, you know what I'm saying, in the library, Kadena Air Force Base Library. It transformed what I believe the martial artist was as this person that fought into like, Miyamoto Musashi mentioned how you can see the way in a lot of different ways. And generalship, being a general, doesn't just apply to being on a battlefield, but applies to any vocation, any craft, anything that you do. You know, it involves planning, strategy, you know, using the tools and the things that you have available to you to make them work for that purpose. And then also just kind of this idea of the martial artist, the warrior, not just training in physical skills, but also, you know, learning tea ceremony, you know, writing poetry, doing calligraphy, doing art. And it really transformed martial arts, not just as a physical activity, but also as a means of expression, because I liked, at the same time, I like to draw, and later on I like to write and do things like that. So it kind of helped me connect these other aspects. And also I like Musashi's approach because I felt I identified with him, because I spent, you know, I've had formal training, but I've spent a lot of my time, you know, with myself, and seeing someone that is as prolific as Musashi and have a similar path. You know, it's hard sometimes when you don't have like lineage, you don't have that structure to kind of like stand and support yourself on. But to see someone like that they were able to, you know, make a name for themselves and to be a quality martial artist, you know, gave me a lot of hope for myself. So yeah, that was one of those things that kind of like got me really, really serious into, you know, when I actually started training with in Shorin-ryu, I came in with a renewed like a focus and that kind of energy. And I was doing great. It gave me a very strong foundation, a good understanding of how to move my body and how to move, right?
So you read the Book of Five Rings when you were like 10 years old?
13.
Wow.
Yeah.
Usually people don't discover that until they're kind of adult, because that's pretty heavy reading for a 13-year-old.
Hey. the first, and I wasn't a reader as a kid, to be honest, but my first book that I read, believe it or not, was the novelization of Flash Gordon. That was the best movie ever. That was my favorite movie. But then, you know, my next thing that I read, serious thing that I read, was Book of the Five Rings, the 13. Yeah, so training Shorin-ryu, and all that's going great until I have like one of those moments again where it's like, wow, okay, I'm liking this, but I'm at a point where I feel like I'm not getting what I need, or what I need is change, you know. And so another really, really profound concept and book that came into my understanding was the Tao Jeet Kune Do, you know. And then from there it was like, okay, so now not only
also not an easy text to
No.
start out with.
That was just
yeah, but the idea now is martial arts as a means of self-expression. And that, you know, caused me to like have to step away from Shorin-ryu and to like look at, which was pretty amazing at the time, because it's like when you viewed martial arts in those days, it was very limited. Like martial arts was considered fighting arts primarily from East Asia, you know what I'm saying? And it was, I mean, we weren't even talking about Muay Thai or Silat or Kali, or we're talking about karate, kung fu, judo, jiu-jitsu, aikido.
right.
You know,
On that pocket.
all the, you know, And then it's like what Jeet Kune Do did for me, it was like, okay, martial arts is not just an East Asian thing. You know, Bruce Lee was being influenced by, you know, Savate and, you know, different forms, you know, within, you know, you know, wrestling. And that really was like, okay, so martial arts is also, you know, boxing is can be seen as a martial arts, fencing, wrestling, and it's not just the East Asian thing, it's a Southeast Asian thing, it's a South Asian thing. Well, it's also a European thing, and
I think it's a human thing, you know.
And that's where I was getting to, you know, and that was the part, and then that's the second part, because I know that the question is like, how does, at some point you're probably going to ask me like, well, how'd you get into African martial arts?
Yes, sir.
And this is actually, I'm kind of giving you guys what got me there, in a sense, before you asked the question. But
Sure.
yeah, it really opened up the idea that martial arts was, again, like you said, a human thing. The question that will come later on for me is, where does Africa fit into that equation? Which
Yes.
was another long process in getting to that point. But yeah, so that's what a little bit about me.
Sure.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
awesome. So when did you start training African martial arts, or start studying them or researching them?
Okay.
And how was that process?
Okay. So, Jeet Kune Do. Jeet Kune Do was the gateway art for me for that. When I started getting involved with Jeet Kune Do, and more specifically, more the JKD concepts side of it, because they had a lot of, Dan Asanto brought in a lot of Southeast Asian martial arts into the picture. And so like when I started seeing things like Muay Thai, Kali, Silat, Bando, what really struck me about a lot of these practices is that, you know, again, coming from a Shorin root background and coming from this idea of what I think, you know, martial arts should look like, you know, it's like this monastery, very austere, very, you know, seeing it in that way, but then seeing it as it's presented in certain Southeast Asian practices, you know, there was music, there was aspects of dance, there was all these different cultural things that were part of these art forms. And that really resonated with me, because at the same time, like while I'm going through all this stuff as a martial artist, I'm also dealing with the ideas of identity as just being a young black male, growing up in the United States, and just dealing with who I am and, you know, what my story is and how do I fit into all of this. So at the time I had no concept of like African martial arts, because I had no concept that Africa had provided any civilized culture and civilizations on the world level. And it's a really sad thing to have to say that, because I think we take for granted the amount of information and access to information we have today.
Yes.
So growing up, you know,
Yeah, totally. Younger generation has
Yeah,
no idea
yeah,
what to look up everything in a book and have to go to the library to
Yeah.
figure out any question.
and then it's like the books, and it's like when you have the book as your only source of information, you know, there wasn't a lot of information about Africa in our history books. I remember this is one of those really, really profound seeds. Again, in Okinawa, I had a world regions teacher. I've told this story many, many times. I hope that she hears this at some point. Her name was Miss Gross, and people feared her because she will let you know. This was like, she would let you know where you stood with her. She spoke her mind.
Yes, sir.
Black lady from the South. She didn't take any shorts, you know. She didn't take any shorts.
Yes,
If you loved her or you hated her, but you didn't cross her. That's just basically what it was. So she was my world regions teacher in 8th grade, and we're going through talking about, you know, the different regions of the world and culture and history, and then we get to Africa. Now, so like the year before, in 7th grade, our book that dealt with Africa, just to give you an idea for the young person here, as far as like history goes, there were pages and pages written about the Middle East and written about Asia and Europe. For Africa, there was 1 page and probably 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph was like, we don't know anything about the history of Africa, and it began talking about slave trade in the 19th century. So that was the history that was in the book. 7th grade, 8th grade, we're gonna deal with Africa. She tells everybody, hey, she was not that nice, but she was harsher than that. But she's like, okay, guys, don't need to bring your books to class for the next 2 weeks. And everyone's like, yeah, all right, because the book was about that thick, and that book and the science book and the math book was like ridiculous to carry. But you guys don't have books now. You guys got iPads and stuff. But yeah, she's like, everyone's celebrating because they have to carry this heavy book to class. And they didn't catch what she said like afterwards, and I caught that. And she was like, yeah, because what we're going to learn isn't in these books. And then so we came, for class, and this was the first time I heard about civilizations, ancient and medieval civilizations in Africa.
And what grade were you in?
I was in 8th grade. 8th grade. And she talked about ancient Egypt, Nubia. She talked about the Moors. She talked about Ghana, Songhai, Mali, planting all these seeds, that will later on come to fruition. But that's just kind of me, again, just dealing with identity and dealing with my place and kind of feeling this like really deep self-hatred about like how I look and where I come from and what I feel my story is in this larger story of humanity. So, going back to martial arts now, so I started getting heavily into JKD and especially like the Southeast Asian martial arts. And at the same time, it starts when I'm maybe 15, but I continue like, throughout high school and up into my 20s. And as my understanding of these, at a little later date, probably like maybe around not ninth grade, probably 10th grade is when I started actually, the seeds that Miss Gross planted in 8th grade actually started to kind of blossom for me and grow. Because I started to read more, I started to like research more, I started to like, try to fill in these gaps and stuff and learn more about African history. And even at that time, like I was very, very like, okay, I'm gonna focus primarily on African history before slave trade, because after slave trade, we just like completely just like lost all our culture, lost all this, and blah, 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 blah. So I'm gonna deal with just primarily with this stuff here. So, okay, I'm doing that. And as I'm learning more about Africa and I'm learning more and about these Southeast Asian fighting arts, and I'm really liking the cultural expression part of it as well as because it's like they're cultural, they have these cultural expressions as well as these effective, kind of like paired together. So I'm like really liking how this looks. And when I was a senior in high school, or maybe right when I graduated from high school, 1993, 94 maybe, my world changed. And it was a movie, and it was Only the Strong. And this movie was the first movie focused on capoeira. So the quick answer to your question, what got me into African martial arts was directly capoeira was my entry into African martial arts. But what got me primed for capoeira was seeing Southeast Asian martial arts and making a correlation between what I was witnessing in capoeira and what I had seen in these other practices, from different cultures. So Yeah, when Capoeira came, when that movie came out, I didn't know what was going on. I was like, I don't know what this is. I was like, I don't know if it's terribly effective, but there's something about the movement, there's something about the music, and it was something about seeing like black and brown bodies actually doing this and doing it, you know, with grace and with, you know, clean, crisp technique, powerful movements, agility, like all these things embodied in those really simple performances. You know what I'm saying? Say what you will about the movie, that movie like really like changed.
I've never seen it. That sounds cool.
That's homework for both of you guys.
Yes,
I know you haven't seen it.
Say it again.
Yeah,
What's the
yeah.
name one more time?
Only the Strong.
Only the Strong.
Mark Dacascos is in it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
cool.
it's you know, it's cheesy 90s, 80s, you know, action, you know what I'm saying, typical story, but it just had such a profound.
You know, when I was in college, I studied Capoeira Angola
Okay.
for a couple semesters, and my favorite part about that was the music, actually, and the dancing and the community of it. You know, I remember I got into it and I thought, well, I'm going to learn martial arts, but then they gave me some funny instruments and like, no, you got to play this thing. You know,
Yeah,
it's like
Whoa.
there's so much going on, and I think that's. Every martial art has something unique about it, you know, and that's one of the things that makes that so special.
Yeah.
That's also about where my African martial arts stops.
Yeah.
Knowledge.
Did you study here in UT?
No, I studied at UW Milwaukee in
Okay.
Wisconsin.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So
Do they have a good program up here at UT?
I've been kind of out of the Capoeira community for a bit, so I'm not sure if they still have it. But there was one at UT, and these are all stories within stories. Maybe we can like hit the scratch the surface yet. But yeah, there was a gentleman named John White and Scott Head that were running classes at UT. But yeah, Capoeira.
How long did you study Capoeira?
Capoeira is my base art. Like it is like I've been doing Capoeira for. I still do Capoeira, even though I'm not as active as I once was. But I'm 46 right now, so it's 20 plus years with Capoeira. Like that is my base art. I would say before Shorin-ryu would have been my base art, but now it's like, you know, Capoeira is like it's my mother art. Without it, and I tell people, and I kind of come to this conclusion myself, was like Capoeira is my superpower, and that my footwork, my body movements, my mechanics, they were okay, you know. But when I started training in Capoeira, all that stuff, all those things, they transformed. And if anyone like today or in the past would say, well, you know, his footwork is really good, his body movements is really good, his understanding of range is really good, he's difficult to take down. All of these things are attributes, you know, I've gotten from Capoeira. I can't say I got it from any other art, even Jeet Kune Do. Like I was still very, very wooden in my movements when I was doing these other systems, but Capoeira really brought out this this fluidity, you know, in me. And coming from a kid that wasn't a good dancer and wasn't good at, you know, at music, but then like seeing how those concepts relate to fighting, and not just to fighting, but just to like just moving. You know what I'm saying? Like Capoeira really freed me in a lot of ways, and it was like that was Capoeira was what I was looking for as a kid, and needing as a kid, but I didn't really get it until I was an adult or a young adult. But
That's awesome.
yeah, so like with Capoeira, there are lots of you know, because there are lots of debates concerning the origins and the history of the art, and it's a thing that's, you know, it's not well documented, so it's like we don't have like you know, concrete evidence, and lots of scholars have kind of, you know, proposed certain theories about the origins of Capoeira. With the aspects of music and dance in Capoeira, it led people to theorize that, oh, well, you know, the enslaved Africans disguised the fighting art as a dance in order to trick their slave masters. Okay. And on the surface, that rings very true. That's really common on how diasporic cultures, negotiated slavery and colonialism was by by hiding in plain sight their practices. And there's in Capoeira there's that to a degree. Although that makes sense from the perspective of the diaspora, these things like the dance aspect of capoeira, the playful aspect of capoeira, and the musical aspect of capoeira, these are things that were inherited from its roots, across the Atlantic. Because what you see it's shocking. I should say it's shocking the number of fighting arts and practices you find in the African diaspora. Like empty hand weapons training, fighting with your feet, your fist, wrestling, fighting with a stick, machete. There are over 20 of these practices, like right here in South America, the Caribbean, even in North America. And so for me, looking at that, and then they all have some of the similar properties in that, they involve a circle of spectators and practitioners. There is a performative aspect to it. There are certain aesthetics that don't necessarily align with, I'm just doing something to beat somebody up. Right. They align on a very different way. So it's like, okay, so capoeira wasn't just like this happenstance thing that, you just got all these different African dances and these different African instruments, and you just put them in this thing and just shook it up, and you just made this thing, this fighting art that does all this stuff. Right. It's no, there's something deeper that's connecting all these practices. And if all these arts on the outside are related to capoeira, then it's it beggars the question of, okay, then what's the parent? Where does this stuff come from?
Absolutely.
So my training in capoeira opened me up to the bigger picture of the diaspora. Because remember earlier I said I was studying African history primarily on the continent. And then when I started doing capoeira, I was like, oh wow, okay. So there's lots of narratives here that haven't been told. The simple narrative is that, Europeans came to Africa with their high technology and they took people, and once they crossed over the Atlantic, everything they were before that just completely went away, and they were just these blank slates to be, slaves and whatever else. And so when I started training capoeira, I started learning about the many different ways enslaved people resisted enslavement and resisted colonialism. And it wasn't always submissive. Many times it was full open revolts. And so I started to see this, again, going back to the big picture, these art forms have to be connected to each other in some kind of way. And then, so that of course needs to be back to continental Africa. Again, then there's more debates about where and which region. And I tend to follow the belief that the systems are all based on a Central African Kikongo foundation. That later on there are these other layers from other cultures that were kind of added onto. Now you can see this in the traditional instruments in capoeira. You have 3 of these bow string instruments called beating bows. You have a standing drum. You have a tambourine, a pandero. Then you have a bamboo scraper. You have an iron cowbell, and I think that's everything. So if you look at those instruments, right, they all speak to like a different region and a different culture presence within the art. And then there's, of course, this overlap. But so in the string instruments in the beating bows, you see like a very strong Central African presence in those instruments. In the past, capoeira drumming, the beating bow was not always part of capoeira, and the drum was played in a way that was more conducive in Central Africa, which is transverse, which is the drum is laid on its, and you sit on it and you play. So you'll still see this in like damier, which is from Martinique, which is a fighting art, or a cousin to capoeira, and they play the drum like this. And then I think that's the one that stands the most. I was going to say Kalinda, but I think in Kalinda they play the drum is upright. So the vertical upright drum, you know, is much more closely associated with West African cultures, like the that's terrible. I can't think of the name of that drum, but it's a drum that's played in Nigeria, and it'll come to me in a moment. But that vertical standing drum, that style is something that you'll see, you know, in West Africa proper. The cowbell, the agogo bell, is another one of those instruments that is connected with the people that are from Nigeria. The pandero is the tambourine is a Mediterranean instrument you'll find in North Africa, and so you can see all these different cultures that kind of like had the influence on the music or whatever else. And so, again, I say that to say that I do believe that the root and the foundation of capoeira is Central African, because it aligns with the way they train for warfare, and two, their cosmology, their way they viewed the world is reflected in the practices. So
it's almost like you like reached through capoeira and like discovered all these other martial arts.
Yeah, most definitely.
What were some of the ones that really struck you, that really influenced your training?
Well, what hit me...
I know of one other one. I think it's called sanbe or sanbi, where you like wrap your hand.
Dambe boxing, dambe.
Oh, dambe. Okay,
Dambe.
Dambe. Yeah. Is that something that you've studied before?
I have. I've played around with it a little bit. I'm going to circle back to that because it's really interesting with dambe boxing how it relates back to shield and spear fighting amongst the Hausa people. Okay. Because that's what the wrapping of the hand is supposed to be, what they call the would be like the spear. And then the defensive hand, the open hand, is the shield.
That's cool.
And what's really interesting is like this is kind of getting more into the work of Hama, where when you look at some of these stances, right, they look, you know, very similar to like some traditional stances you see in like traditional arts, you know, karate or taekwondo or whatever, especially like more of the Okinawan styles where you use really deep, you know, low stances. And from like a Western boxing perspective, it's very, very, very strange, the postures. But what's interesting, and I've done a little video on this, is like when you take some of the postures and you put a shield and a spear in the hand, it makes a lot more sense. You know what I'm saying? It looks like it's kind of crazy to see how fast it transforms. And you know, it could be that for Dembe boxing, that this was just kind of more of a metaphor for them, like saying, okay, well, this is the shield, this is the spear. You know what I'm saying? Just the idea this one's going to be primarily do for blocking, checking, you know, containing, and this is the one that you're going to use for the striking. So not saying that it's like a one-to-one comparison, or not saying that like, okay, you trained spear and shield by doing Dembe boxing, but I think that it reinforced the idea, and there's like correlations between the practice of empty hand fighting and Dembe boxing,
Oh,
when then translating it back to like
When you look at like Okinawan Karate, you can see the influence of Kobudo and weapons training. I mean, same thing with Eskrima, you know, and Filipino martial arts. There's such a correlation between the weapon and unarmed. And
people have even been doing this with Chinese martial arts. A lot of low, deep stances. They're kind of like showing how, you know, some of these movements are weapons movements. You know what I'm saying? To explain some of these stances and stuff. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's probably the most useful weapon you could use back in the day would be an actual weapon, not your bare hand. So a lot of this stuff comes out of actual warfare, where you're using an actual weapon, and that's like, okay, well, for civilian use here, you can, this is how you can box, you know, this is how you can strike.
Yeah. So, Derby boxing is one of those ones that are real popular. It's getting a lot of attention now. As far as I think so like after I started like going down the wormhole of like continental arts, I think the next two that were like things that were accessible to me was, you know, connecting Egypt to Africa, and then realizing that the Egyptians were documenting like systematic martial arts practices, you know, 5,000 years ago. They're like they had a very, very well developed wrestling system that's displayed on the walls. Now it's not an instructional manual, but you have to bear in mind, it's like this is when you can look at something. Now some of the things it's kind of hard to kind of decipher like what it is they're doing, but when you can see like what they're doing, what they're trying to portray. This is an artist who's may not necessarily be a wrestler depicting this. Right. You know, 5,000 years ago, it just kind of like you don't see anything like there's no like new wrestling techniques you see there. Sure. But like you see that, oh wow, we've been doing this. As you know, we've been able to document that we've been doing this for 5,000 years. Been doing this longer than that, and it's really, it goes back to kind of like tying in humanity, like back to like, you know, hey, as different as we think we are, we deal with problems in very, very similar ways, and just like seeing some of those leg sweeps, those single leg takedowns, it's like. We've been doing this since we were cavemen. I mean, we're just rediscovering what we've already known or done sometime in the past in some civilization. Yeah, and I just like with wrestling itself, and I wish I would have done more wrestling as a kid, like more like formally done wrestling. Like it is like I will go so far as to say it's a universal art for mammalian, for mammals. Like you see. Right. The idea of coming in close, like you watch cats move with each other. Like it's jujitsu right there. Like watch the cats like tumble around on the ground with each other. Like it's amazing. And just as humans, wrestling is something that we all do. On the continent in Africa, there's very few cultures that don't do wrestling. Wrestling is like, you know, widely represented across the continent. And in ancient Egypt, wrestling was, out of all the combat sports that were practiced in ancient Egypt, wrestling was the most documented, the most revered. Wow. So like when I started to connect and see how, one, wrestling, stick fighting are practices you find throughout the continent. Looking at Egypt, they were the practices that were like the most documented in Egyptian iconography, and kind of seeing that, you know, Egypt is part of Africa. As much as we want to think that it's separate, it's a part of it, and it's reflective of that, especially in many ways. In this case, in its combat sports and martial arts traditions. So going through the wrestling style, you can look at some of the images. And you can see aspects that look like catch wrestling. You can see aspects that look like judo, jiu-jitsu. You can look at aspects and see stuff that's similar to like folk wrestling and belt wrestling. You can even see, you know, actions that are happening on the ground. You know what I'm saying? I haven't been able to decipher any of the ground stuff, you know, because they're kind of like sort intertwined. And like we know very little about Egyptian wrestling as far as like the rules and things of that nature, but you can see how it had these many different aspects and different phases as part of its practice, and you know, we're still kind of learning more. In regards to stick fighting, you know, we're talking about like at a point in time when swords were like these, you know, this was a sword, you know what I'm saying? It was a long dagger that had a hilt construction that allowed it to do other stuff besides stab and thrust. So when you start getting into these longer pieces, these more stable, robust, you know, hilt connections, then you start getting into these actions of being able to, you know, sword fight. But before that, you know, you're using sticks, or you're using clubs and things of that nature, mace, axe, to do the work. So whereas like today, stick fighting kind of serves as a surrogate for sword fighting, right? You replace the blade with a stick, and you can train it safely, or you can, you know, disguise it, or you can do whatever else. In those days, in Egypt, the stick fighting, actually the stick fencing, I should say, informed the use of the blade as that developed. So you would train with the stick. I guess what I'm saying, the stick using the stick came before using the blade, the sword, so to speak. So those actions of the stick actually inform the use of the blade, as opposed to now the blade informs the stick. So the Egyptians practice, they had at least like 4 modalities of stick fighting that they practiced. They used really, really long sticks that they used in, you'll see this mostly in the Old Kingdom, where they have these jousting bouts on boats. And they're using these like thrusting, prodding, probing motions with these long punting poles for, you know, moving the rafts. And they're like fighting against like different crews. And they're using a lot of thrusting movements, a lot of, you know, swings and levering movements to knock the person off the boat. When the rafts sometimes come close together, they break into like wrestling matches and things of that nature. So you had this one style of what they call water jousting or water polo. Also,
that's awesome.
Yeah. And then you see like the use of the stick in 2 hands, and not in the context of the water jousting, but you see the use of the stick with both hands. There's a few clips of that, scenes of that, during the battles with the sea people. Some sticks are kind of out on the field as well. Long stick, thrusting and prodding, kind of analogous like spear work. And then they would do not as long of a stick, use it in 2 hands, and like what you'll see in like Suri stick fighting in Ethiopia, or Taktiv in Egypt today, or Wakaf that you'll see in Algeria, which is just using the stick with 2 hands. Then they had single stick, which is using a stick in 1 hand. And then they used double stick. I mentioned the Astrakhan a little earlier. And what you'll see in some of the battle reliefs is the pairing of 2 weapons. So you'll have like either like a throw stick and a spear, or some kind of configuration of like a weapon that you can cast, or one that you can kind of fight in close quarters with together. So you have this idea of dual wielding that's depicted. And then you have stick and shield. Now I wanted to save that, because what's really interesting about stick and shield in the Egyptian context is that the type of shield that they're using is like it's not really a full shield, it's a plank shield that's strapped along the arm, right? Now most African shields are center grip shields, whether they have like a post, or, you know, high, you hold it kind of in the center grip. Well, in the Middle Kingdom, shields were strapped onto the shoulder. I mean, not shoulder, onto the arm. And then later on, as we're getting towards the New Kingdom, the shields went from being strapped to being held vertically. So what's really interesting about this practice, so the stick fighting images that we have is two fighters with these planked shields, all strapped on their arms. And it's from the Middle Kingdom, so it makes sense that this is the type of shield that they're using. Now there's only one other people that I found on the continent that are stick fighters, and they practice stick fighting, but they use a plank shield, and that's the Nuba people in Sudan. And what's really intriguing about that connection is that they're one of the only people that practice. So, like I said, the Egyptians practice several modalities of stick fighting, as well as their wrestle, stick fighting, whatever else. What's really interesting is that the Nuba people are renowned as wrestlers, and they practice at least three of the modalities that the Egyptians practiced in the past. Fighting with the stick, in two hands, single stick, and then fighting with the shield. What's interesting is the shield, though, the way that they strap the shield onto the arm, and most African cultures don't do that. Most of them are holding the shield straight up and down like that. And the Nuba were people that were in connection with the Egyptians, from the past. So it's really cool to see, especially when we're looking at how we start to kind of piece this stuff together. Having those kinds of connections with living traditions, it helps me in my research to kind of reconstruct some of these practices, because I have some living models to see what it could have looked like, or even what could have been evolved from it. So when you ask me like what were the arts that influenced me, like outside of capoeira, so like once I got into capoeira, like I saw Egyptian martial arts, and then I saw Zulu stick fighting and Guinea stick fighting. And those were the two continental arts that I had somewhat access to, and I started to incorporate the practice of those into what I was doing. Later on, I would say, because I was always interested in Kalinda and Damier or Lajda from Martinique, amongst other things. But I think another turning point for me is like seeing Colombian. So I say like my base weapon system, like my foundational weapon system, as far as like the machete goes, would be Colombian machete, con machete. Seeing that was like, that was kind of like the, if I were to like say like what my foundational weapons practices were, Colombian machete would be like one of the main things.
That's fascinating. That's awesome. What a story.
Yeah.
So how do you bring all of these different martial arts together in your program? It sounds like you have your own sort of system, the Guild of the Silent Sword. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah.
What's that mean?
Yeah. So all this stuff is kind of morphing, and I'm kind of trying to figure out like what it is right now, to be honest. And for me, it's like I have to say, well, these are things that are uniquely my expressions, are uniquely part of like my, like you take me out of the context, right? Because I have to be respectful of the cultures that I'm like, having access to, whatever that access is. I have to be respectful to that. And it goes back to like my needs as a person, as Da'Mon, my unique story here in North America. So my system it fulfills those needs for me. So like when you study a martial art, especially an African martial art, it's not quite the same as like going to like train, karate or kung fu. Early on when I was like asking, because there was a period of time when I was like actively, asking, people that I had met from the continent about their martial arts. And like they were like, well, what do you mean martial arts? Like, what are you talking about? Like, are you, that's an Asian thing, like, what do you mean? I was asking the wrong question, what I'm saying? I was looking at it from the wrong perspective, like there are plenty of these combat traditions that are practiced, but not necessarily that they're described as martial arts in the sense that they're packaged and presented in a way that's accessible and consumed by people who are outside of it.
Sure. I feel like when we were growing up, the whole concept of martial arts is so new to most people. Even experienced martial artists, who've been trained for many, many years, maybe 20, 30 years, they didn't really know many other martial arts besides karate, And it's only in modern times that we have a better understanding, I feel like, of martial arts as a whole. And we can like talk about, these are all martial arts. Like martial arts is a primal thing that we do, like since the days of caveman. But I think that conversation would have been more strange to somebody like 30 years ago talking about, karate and how, boxing is a martial art and wrestling is a martial art. And these are all martial arts. We just don't think about them that way, you know?
Exactly.
I think we've come a long way in our understanding in the last 30 years.
Yes,
of martial arts.
most definitely. And even more so, like with African fighting, it's like things like Da'Mon boxing. This is not something that kids will go to like school and train. It was something that was practiced amongst the Butchers Guild, amongst the Hausa. And it was something that was like culturally part of that that group. And so like the thing that happens with Africa is that it gets kind of lumped into just like this one monolithic, structure. And as Americans, the level of diversity is mind-boggling for us.
You feel like saying all of Europe is the same. I mean, there's just so much going on there.
And it's even fairer to say that for Europe because it's such a smaller space, and people are more culturally connected
with Rome and stuff like that.
Yeah. So it's easier to say it for Europe because of the proximity and the distance. For Africa, like you take a country like Ethiopia, which I'm not sure how large Ethiopia is. I don't think it's larger than Texas, but it may be larger than Texas. But you take a country like Ethiopia, you have over 100 different ethnic groups that speak like 80 different languages in that one country.
That's just one.
Yeah, it's one country. The level of diversity, like it's like, it's kind of lost on us in a sense. So, so it's like when we're looking at these things, we're looking at things that are specific cultural practices, and it may not be something that's accessible to everyone in the same way that like training in jiu-jitsu or Muay Thai would be, and it may not even be valued in the same way, So like my needs were, and I say that to say, so like if I were to do Da'Mon boxing, and of course people can go and do these things, but I have to understand like what this practice has for this culture is kind of specific to this culture. It hasn't kind of reached a point where it's like,
I feel like if you wanted to go be a sumo wrestler, it'd be a little weird as a Westerner. I mean, some people do it, but it's a very uniquely Japanese cultural artifact that has a lot of significance.
And the culture is like very much interwoven into yeah. And so again, people go and do Da'Mon boxing. They'll go and they'll do like, I don't want to say that there's like this closeness to it. It's just like we haven't got to the point where it's like, okay, I'm a Senegalese lamb wrestler. I'm gonna go and train Da'Mon boxing in Nigeria. Then I'm gonna go to Madagascar and train Morindi kickboxing there. And then I'm gonna go to South Africa and train Nguni stick fighting. Then I'm gonna go to Egypt and train Tativ. You don't kind of have that kind of stuff happening yet. That kind of, multi-cross pollination of these African practices. everything's kind of more specific to the groups, even though
Right.
people do from outside the group participate in these activities. So like just kind of acknowledging the role the art plays within that culture is going to be very different than the way the art is used and expressed by me, because I have a different need.
Right.
Yeah.
So like as a martial artist and as a Western martial artist of African descent, like I have to have conversations, whether it's like with words
Right.
or with movement, with people that come from different combat traditions. And so that's kind of like my perspective. That's kind of like my orientation. So what I try to do is I try to excel on one level, excel within the cultural context of these arts, whether it's capoeira, whether it's mathrag or Colombian machete or Moringi boxing or whatever else. I try to excel within the context of those cultures.
Right.
At the same time, I want to also excel in a larger world and say, okay, all right, well, you know, you do Muay Thai, I do capoeira, Moringi boxing. Like let's spar. Let's like, you know, see what happens. And it's like, oh, okay, this is how you can make your capoeira and your Moringi boxing work, and have this conversation with Muay Thai or with whatever striking art, or oh, you know, you do jiu-jitsu, or you do catch wrestling, or you do Greco-Roman wrestling. I do lamb wrestling. You know, we mix it up, and then it's like, you know, so that's kind of like where I'm at. I'm in that crossroads of like wanting to respect and follow the tradition within this context, at the same time also wanting to, and for the purpose of highlighting and educating and enlightening, and then just also just kind of bringing respect to these practices. I interact with other people,
Right.
you know, other martial artists that, you know, I have to be able to like demonstrate the validity of these practices, whether it's through sparring or whether it's through just like the benefits of its movement, or even just through like the history and the culture. So I'm having to take it outside of the cultural context and then, you know, interact with other people. So that makes what I do different in a sense, unique to myself. So a great example of this, and not to be long-winded, but I do a couple of different forms of like long stick, right? And each one of these practices, they are not, I mean, they are practices, they are not like, they're not like, because we get into the idea of like sparring and fighting and the differences between like, you know, what each group decides is like combative display within that group. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So like in Colombian machete, you know, we're not having an all-out machete fight with each other when we're moving around. There are certain rules and certain aesthetics that govern how we interact with each other. That's very different than if I say, hey, you do Kali, I do Colombian machete, or hey, you do German Messer, I do Colombian machete, or hey, you do, you know, Wing Chun butterfly knives, Kubudo weapons, let's get together, let's spar, and see what happens. That's another conversation.
Right.
Then a third level to that is like, oh, well, how do I use this weapon, this machete, this stick, in a self-defense situation? And that's a totally different conversation. So I have to acknowledge that it's like it's a circle within a circle within a circle, what I'm kind of dealing with. So when we get to what I do, Guild of the Silent Sword that's kind of what we do. That's our approach, is try to excel and understand and practice the art within the cultural context. At the same time, we're also trying to bring those lessons, that wisdom, that understanding out into the larger conversation of martial artists. And that's kind of like, that's our approach. So just kind of,
Absolutely.
you know, wanting to show that it is my personal expression as opposed to like a complete reflection of what's done culturally there at all times. So, I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, yeah. Trying to bring sort of cultural awareness to these different aspects while, you know, saying your own little piece in a way that's not disrespectful to those practices. And
then showing the validity of it in other spheres. I mean, there was a Western martial arts conference in Racine, Wisconsin.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah. And so a lot of the guys, they practice historical European martial arts, and they were doing like a Dusak, which is like a German short German cut and slashing tool weapon, and you know we were doing some sparring, and I was using Colombian machete against the Dusak guys. They were doing Dusak fighting, and again, two different circles, but I think from that exchange, people walked away like, oh wow, like this whatever he's doing was really, really effective. It was really, really, you know, good to see a different perspective on this type of weapon, and it created this interest in Colombian machete. And so even though I wasn't using it in a very traditional way,
right.
But that tradition was informing my movements when I was fighting, you know, live fighting and stuff. And I think that's the role that I would like to play for like my mentors and for the people who have, you know, embraced me and shared their culture and have allowed me to do this. It's like, oh wow, so they see me do Colombian machete and, you know, do pretty well. It's like, oh, and that brings like respect and attention to, you know, the elders, and it's like, okay, so now people know more about it and want more about it. So that's kind of like, I feel, my unique role in this situation.
Awesome.
It is. It's awesome.
Well, it has been a pleasure, Mr. Stith.
Da'Mon is fine.
Mr. Stith, we've had just a great conversation. Any final thoughts?
I'm just so fascinated. You know, I think it comes down to that tinkering you were talking about, and that's something, listening through your story today, that tinkering is always there in the background. Like, oh, like what is this, and how can I work with this and use this, and then bring it back out, right? And say, hey, check this out, right? Let's talk about this. And I think it's wonderful and beautiful. And
For me, that's been the path, and that's always, because and it's taken me a while to get to the level of like comfort to say like, you know, my career as a martial artist is spent as a tinkerer, you know, as a person that has had the benefit of people sharing with me, but a lot has been, you know, my own path.
If you enjoyed that podcast, please consider liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel, as well as hitting the notification bell. We offer in-person, group, and private lessons at our facility in Kyle, Texas, as well as virtual lessons anywhere in the world. If you'd like to learn more about our programs, you can find us online at risingphoenixtkd.com.